and after witness testimony, we'll each have 5 minutes of questions. In December, President Obama signed into law the Every Student Succeeds Act, which proves our committee can work on difficult issues successfully, but a law that isn't properly implemented isn't worth the paper it's written on, which is why we're going to have strong oversight on that law and why we're having this hearing today. Because we're here for the similar purpose of conducting oversight on the 2012 generic drug user fee amendments for the Food and Drug Administration Act. Specifically, those are the fees that are negotiated between the FDA and the generic drug makers to give the agency additional resources intended to speed the review of safe and effective generic drugs. This is the first oversight hearing since those amendments were passed in 2012. It comes at a crucial time. Since 2012, the FDA has received nearly $1 billion in user fees, and performance does not seem to be living up to Congress or the patient's expectations, as the number of generic drugs approved each year remains about the same. The user fee agreements are due to be reauthorized next year, and so now seems to be a good time to take a look at what's happened. The generic drugs program is a success story, I think anyone would have to say. It started 30 years by one of our committee members, Senator Hatch and Henry Waxman. It's increased competition and lowered drug prices. The program was created to make it easier for generic drugs to come in. Generic drugs, of course, are those drugs that are allowed to come into the market after a drug manufacturer's patent expires over a period of time. Generic drugs have to have FDA approval also, these copies, but they don't have to have full clinical trials, and so a lot of expense is avoided. As a result, more generic drugs in the market create competition and lower prices for consumers. Over the last 30 years, what we've seen is that today now 88% of prescription drugs purchased in the United States are generic drugs. 30 years ago, that number was 0. However, in 2012, 26 years after the first law passed, it became clear the drug approval program needed an overhaul. More generic drugs are coming from overseas. Companies in China and India were expected less frequently than American companies. This put patients at risk and companies at a disadvantage. There's a backlog of 4,700 applications waiting to be reviewed, and the median approval time to get review of the generic drug was 30 months. That far surpasses the 180-day time frame for review that was laid out in the Hatch-Waxman amendments in 1984. And additionally, in 2012, many generic sterile injectable drugs were in shortage, causing doctors and hospitals to scramble to ensure patients were getting the best treatment possible. So Congress passed these amendments in 2012. The idea is based upon similar agreements with other manufacturers in the FDA. Congress anticipated that generic drug facilities abroad would be brought up to the same standards as facilities in the U.S. Two, that American patients would benefit from faster approval of generic drugs, and those two actions together would create more competition and lower the price for the drugs. But as I mentioned, in 2012, there was a backlog of 4,700 pending applications, and the information we have shows that that's dropped to 3,500 applications. The HHS Inspector General has reported that the FDA is improving its inspections abroad, but the troubling news is that it seems to take FDA longer to get generic drugs through the approval process. The approval times, the median approval times have slowed from 30 to 48 months, and the original number hoped for was 180 days. As we discuss these issues today, I think it's important to keep in mind that drug pricing is a legitimate, real concern of Americans, but it's part of a larger concern of rising health care costs. The Congressional Budget Office announced this week that federal spending for the major health programs, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera, represents the largest fraction of the projected growth in mandatory spending in 2016. Two, While we're lowering prices, we want to make sure we continue to invest in and incentivize the development of life-saving therapies. Congress responded to that, Senator Murray's leadership and Senator Blunt especially, adding $2 billion to the appropriation process for NIH. That's $32 billion now for NIH in a year, but the pharmaceutical manufacturers spend $50 billion in a year coming up with new cures and treatments. And third, to try to balance the growth, restraining the growth of drug prices and encouraging investment and incentives for life-saving therapies, we need to avoid unnecessary regulatory burdens that drive up costs, and we need to do our best to keep the marketplace competitive. For the last year, we've been working in a bipartisan way on ways to avoid unnecessary regulatory burdens. In the Aging Committee, Senator Collins and Senator McCaskill have been examining what improvements may be necessary to ensure that the FDA expedites applications for generic drugs to keep the marketplace competitive and drug prices down. But still, over the last 30 years, this is a success story. Generic drugs have gone from 0 to 88% of the marketplace. It's hard to imagine what the prescription drug market today would look like without them. I look forward to the testimony today.